Joining me now are two people who have been victims of a disinformation campaign in Russia. Masha Gessen, longtime journalist, and Mike McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia for the United States. Let me put up something here that the RAND Corporation, sort of one of the uber defense think tanks in America, wrote about the Russia propaganda model. And Masha, I want you to sort of explain how this is implemented. This is how they describe it. They just disseminate an interpretation of emergent events that appears to best favor their themes and objectives. If one falsehood or misrepresentation is exposed or is not well received, the propagandists will discard it and move on to a new explanation. The combination of high volume, multi-channel, and continuous messaging makes Russian themes more likely to be familiar to their audiences. That it's almost like done in real time. Give us an example of how you experienced it.
Yeah, I wouldn't actually call myself a victim of Russian disinformation. Mike is much more in that category, I'm afraid. But I think that the biggest thing to understand about it is that it's less about what you would expect, which is pushing some sort of one interpretation, one line. It's more about creating a cacophony. It's, you are supposed to come out the other end feeling like there's no such thing as truth.
And that is the point. That's kind of the way I feel here sometimes.
Well, I think we're starting to experience it firsthand here. Because that, you know, and that's, I mean, Trump has a very good instinctual feel for it. Sometimes he just says things that are the opposite of the facts in front of us. And sometimes he kind of goes, yeah, whatever. And sometimes he says, well, maybe that and maybe this, right? And then in the end, we feel like, you know, all of these versions of, I hesitate to call it reality, are equidistant from the truth, you know, and there's nothing to latch onto. Everything is mush.
Mike, I know that I want to bring up two examples of just within Russia, and I think it was when you were there, both of these. When soldiers without insignia on their green uniforms seized control of Crimea in 2014, at the time, Vladimir Putin repeatedly denied they were Russian, and then a year later, he started to boast that they were there. And then, of course, there was the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 that was shot down over Ukraine, and all the various explanations in country that the Russian government did. Explain how effective it was internally.
Well, internally, I think they've done very well in terms of mastering disinformation, and I agree completely with what Masha just said. The goal is not necessarily to present one argument versus the other all the time. It's just to say there are no truths, there are no facts, it's all relative. I've heard Vladimir Putin say that directly when he met with Barack Obama, President Obama, one time. Secondly, however, when there are facts, it's to put out arguments that say those are the wrong facts. And so the two examples you just used are an illustration of that second tactic. And I would call that also related to that another tactic, whataboutism, to change the channel, to say, well, you did that there, well, what about this over here? And that is another tactic that they use to confuse the terrain and to make people to be confused about the facts, that there are no facts and that there are no truths in the world.
This didn't happen organically, though, Masha. When Putin came in, he seized control of the media, essentially in various forms. Some directly by the state, some via Gazprom, and some just simply via intimidation.
Right. I want to add something, though, to the Crimea story, because I think it's a really great example. So when he said, after a year, when he started boasting that, yes, there were Russians on the ground, he wasn't admitting something that everybody knew. He was saying, I assert my right to say whatever I want, whenever I want to. Sometimes it will be true, sometimes it won't be. But I'm king of reality, right? And what are you going to do about it? It's a power move when he lies, and it's a power move when he tells the truth, because only he chooses when he does what, right? As for the media, yes, Russia had not an incredibly healthy independent media, but had some independent media when he became president. And the first thing he did was he moved to take control of broadcast television, and then he moved on national broadcast television, and then local television, and then newspapers. And now, 20 years later, we have no independent media.
All right, I want to give you a description that I read recently. It says, what's happened in Russia would be like Fox News taking over the airwaves in the U.S., booting MSNBC from cable TV, and reducing the left to broadcasting online from a small private apartment in Brooklyn. Is that the way Russian media looks these days?
That's how it feels.
Okay.
Although, but imagine that Fox News has a lot of subsidiaries. So it's like Fox News and Sinclair, and they kind of work in concert. but they're also, Fox News is privately owned.
Right.
But the biggest national broadcaster in Russia is state-owned.
Right. Well, it's interesting, and Mike, you know this a lot about Putin. Here's a quote that was attributed to him that he thinks that said the following when he was asked about how he thinks the press works. Putin said, "Here's an owner. They have their own politics, and for them it's an instrument. The government also is an owner, and the media that belong to the government must carry out our instructions. And media that belong to a private businessman, they follow their orders." And it's as if Masha was setting me up here. Apparently Putin said, look at Murdoch. Whatever he says will be. This is this is sort of the effectiveness of Putin over time by looking over and says, what's the difference?
Well, that's his view. That's most certainly his view. And that's why one of the first things he did in the year 2000 was to seize control of 2 of the national television networks so that they were completely controlled by the government. He understands the power of media. What he doesn't accept is he doesn't like competition. What he said about Murdoch may be true, but the advantage we have in the West, at least today, is that there are multiple sources, right? And he is fearful of that, and that's what he wanted to eliminate in Russia. Now, he's done it on the airwaves. I think he's got more problems digitally. And if you look at trends inside Russia, the older you are, the more likely you are to watch TV. The younger you are, the more likely you are to get your news from digital platforms, just like in our country. That presents a problem for him in the long run. But today, he controls the media space rather effectively. And I would add one other thing, Chuck. If in the first decade or so, he focused on controlling it within Russia, in the last decade, he has begun to export his ideas through multiple channels, both digital, media, and television.
There's a phrase that I was reading in this research that really struck me, and it's called toxic cynicism. That is what is in Russia right now, and that is what he hopes to export to the West.
And I think we have a lot of it here, native-born. Right? I mean, we have it in the White House.
We didn't need help. I mean, well, now he just added an accelerant, like a steroid.
I think that's exactly it, an accelerant or an amplifier. But I think that he and Trump share a basic sense of the world, and their sense of the world is that nothing matters, nothing is true,
nothing's on
everything
the level,
is for sale,
right? Nothing is on the level. Yeah.
Yes, everything is for sale, and that money, money equals power, and power equals money, and it's unitary. Right? There can be no checks and balances.
Right.
There can be no systems. Any kind of formal relationship is always a lie.
Mike, it seems as if Putin's view of the world, if Trump shares it, China certainly wants to essentially act that way. Is there a danger that the West is losing this philosophical battle?
Well, I think the West needs to understand they're in an ideological battle, and I would use the word ideology on purpose, which is that Putin has his view of the world, a kind of conservative, orthodox nationalism, anti-multilateralism. For years and years and years, he was helping to propagate those ideas through Sputnik and RT and Internet Research Agency and even the GRU, the Russian military intelligence. And lately, he has now found some allies. He has some friends now. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Salvini in Italy, and most certainly he considers President Trump to be an ideological ally in that fight. And what's different from this ideological struggle compared to the Cold War is that the main battlegrounds are not between states, but within states. And that's a place that he is, I think, having an effect. And I think we need to wake up and figure out how we address that challenge. It's especially difficult when many within our own country are ideologically ally closer to Putin than they do with liberal democracy.
Masha, what can we learn from the experience over the last 15 years in Russia, where we saw essentially whatever freedom of the press happened gets eroded as quickly as it did? What can we learn from this to sort of maybe not make some of the same mistakes?
Well, that's an incredibly hard question, because obviously we haven't had a lot of success in Russia in resisting the damage that Putin has done. I think that the thing that journalists can learn is that, this setup is a net loss for us. Dealing with a president who doesn't think that there's such a thing as truth, dealing with a president who's fundamentally dishonest, who basically has two ways of interacting with the media, either to lie or to kind of go, yeah, whatever.
Right.
And that's, that both of them are in equal measure the opposite of accountability. And a lot of our job is to hold power to account, right? And we can't do our job under these conditions. So what I think we have to do is we have to think about how we mitigate harm, right? How do we lessen the damage that he's doing? And I don't think we've been doing a great job. I think there's some examples of really terrific work, but mostly, we're still trying to sort of act as though we can force things to be normal. And that basically ends up normalizing Trump.
So what would you do when you say force things to be normal? I know what you mean. We sort of almost, we get on our high horse. That's not the way it's done. That's not the way it's done, rather than focusing on what he did.
It's not just that we get on our high horse. It's that we try to cover Trump as one would cover a normal president,
yes.
right? On the one hand, on the other hand. Well, that kind of coverage places Trump at the center. Right? And so we're trying to create a situation where sort of you can have both sides that are equidistant from Trump, which is insane on the face of it.
Mike McFaul, you were involved, you've met with a lot of dissidents that are actively trying to deal with Putin in Russia. What breaks him, if he breaks?
Well, I think an effective thing is just to keep revealing facts, especially about corruption. People want to know about the facts, and I would say the same thing about our country, too. I think sometimes there is a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand that we present with various political debates in the United States. And here, now I want to put on my professorial hat. All hypotheses are not equal, and to treat them as equal is actually distorting to the truth. And so if you have one set of hypotheses that has evidence to support it, and another hypothesis which has no evidence to support it, reporting on those two hypotheses in and of itself is a distortion of the facts. And I think Russians have learned that, and they keep going back to the facts as their best weapon. And I think we as a society need to do that itself. You don't get your own facts. You can have your own arguments. You can have your own opinions. But 2 + 2 needs to equal 4 for Democrats and Republicans every day, not just Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays.
Masha, I've had a lot of dust-ups about the Ukraine allegations on this show over the last month, and I've had somebody ask me who works for one of these folks that have been on about this, well, what's wrong with having a different opinion about Ukraine? And I'm like, well, but this isn't based in any fact. And it's a round and round conversation.
Right. Well, no, we get roped and trapped into arguments about facts. You can't argue about facts. You can argue about interpretations. You can argue about opinions. You cannot argue about facts. And I think that, one of the hacks that we as journalists have tried to use to deal with this is these front of the operation fact-checking columns, right? And I think they've done more harm than good, because basically they set up an argument about facts.
Right.
Kind of go, he said this, it could be true, but it could not be true, and then we're like in this discussion of, which square is better. Right. When in fact the story should be not is this true, but Donald Trump lied again.
Masha Gessen, Mike McFaul, we didn't solve the problem, but I think we have a better idea of how it works in Russia, and perhaps how we can see the warning signs before they make a major breakthrough in this country. Thank you both, and I hope you have a Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe, and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.